Okay, so now we turn to applied aspects of the theoretical concepts that we talked about in chapter 4 and chapter 5. And this last half is really about how to do business in specific countries and the things that we can kind of draw from what we learned so far earlier in the semester. So let's start out with China. So what does it look like to do business in China? Well, the first thing we have to remember about China is the concept of guanxi. And in class, I'm going to go into detail a little bit more, but let's just know that it means social connections. And more importantly, the social connections. It means that favors are owed to you because you've done favors to other people. And so the way it works in Chinese culture is when you do a favor for someone else, you expect the next favor to be even better. So guanxi is kind of a powerful position. It's when you're owed a lot by a lot of different people, and you can really make things happen. So guanxi is this concept that it is in no way exists in the United States. It's not networking. It's not power. It's just hard for us to understand, but it is one of the most important concepts of doing business in China. One of the things also about Chinese is that they're not going to focus on profit as much as we think that they're going to. Their own values and principles are more important. Now, what those values and principles are different than what values and principles that Americans tend to have. But it's always important to put yourself in their frame of mind about what values are most important, because that's what they're going to focus on. Another thing about Chinese is that they tend to start their meetings very slow, and they don't like to talk about business. And basically, what they're doing is they're gauging you on what kind of person that you are. What kind of emotions do you have? What kind of intellect do you have? What kind of etiquette do you have? And they're kind of feeling you out to figure out whether they want to continue doing business with you or not. They don't want to jump right into business. They want to know more about you, and kind of they want to judge you very slowly. And then when they decide what they want to do, Chinese tend to move very fast, but they tend to move slowly until they decide a plan of action and what they want to do, which is definitely different than the Western way of doing business, which is to really, just take for granted that people want to make money, and that, that business will be good for both people. That's not how the Chinese tend to do it. Um, in in China, as I mentioned in class, reciprocity is very important. It means that both sides are getting something from a deal. If one side gets too much from a deal, the deal disappears. It's not like the United States where there's a contract and the deal remains in place even though one side's kind of getting all the deal. Another concept that is very non-Western is this idea of face, and this is that you don't embarrass people in any way, in a public way. In most Asian cultures, it's like this. To be embarrassed in front of other people is a very, very bad offense. It can ruin people's careers. I mean, in the United States, we don't have this problem. In most Western countries, we have second chances. People can go bankrupt and come back from it. You can embarrass yourself, in class or in the workplace, and it's not a big deal. In China, it is. It's a huge deal, and that's what the loss of face is. You have to be very careful not to offend people in other countries. Um, and then finally, remember about China that it's a very long-term focused country, and that when you enter into a deal with the Chinese, they're not looking at making profit or doing really well in the next year or two. They're looking at this like a 10, 15, 20-year plan. So you have to, they put a lot of effort into it, but it's not going to show dividends right away. Working with China is a really long-term kind of thing. All right, let's turn to Russia here. Russia's an interesting one because they're definitely non-Western too, and Russians like to do things face to face and build personal relationships, because the rule of law doesn't mean quite the same thing in Russia as it does in the Western world, and they want to know who they're dealing with, because at the end of the day, it's kind of just a person that has to solve disputes, one on one. So they really want to be able to trust you, and you have to know what you're getting into in Russia. So you want to use local consultants. You want to know how different areas are viewed and who the important people are in those different areas. And ethics are completely different. Russians give tons of gifts. They give luxury items. Americans would kind of view it as bribery in some ways. When you want to do business, it's like, oh, you show up in Russia and someone gives you, a really, really nice piece of jewelry, or a really, really nice watch, or maybe even a car. Um, that's unheard of in the United States, but it's something more common when you're talking about doing hundreds of millions of dollars of business. That the Russians will try to do. They see it as a gift giving kind of tact, and that's not, to Americans, is seen as unethical. Russians like exclusivity. They like for you to deal, American companies or foreign companies, to deal only with them if you're dealing with Russia. So they don't want to know that you're dealing with 3 or 4 different Russian firms. I mentioned that they like to do business face-to-face, email, faxes. They don't get responded to. You've got to go over to Russia and do business with them. Okay. So another concept that Russians like is they like to hear that there's mutual gain, that you're not taking advantage of them with the deal, that both sides are winning, and so it's a win-win negotiations, because it's a sort of you need to look powerful, you need to look strong, and that's the most important thing. And so if you're seen as being taken advantage of, they won't do the deal even if they need to do the deal. Another thing, Russians don't have quite the terminology that we have about doing business. We sort of take for granted that we know all these uh, words about business. You guys are business majors, and business concepts. Well, that major doesn't exist in most universities around the world. In America, it does. We have a lot of business majors, but in other countries, they don't have business majors. It's like a vocation. It's not something that people study in school, even the ones that become managers and run companies. So we use a lot of terminology that other countries tend to not really know. And so you have to make sure that you clarify that when you're doing business. And finally, again, like the Chinese, Russians view contracts as only if they're beneficial to both parties and they continue to be beneficial are they binding. So once one party starts to get a lot better deal than the other one, the contract is essentially worthless, and a company can walk away from it. Again, completely different in the United States. All right, India. A couple things we want to talk about with India. Indians don't want to get into personal life. It's a much different kind of area. They don't want to talk about children. They don't want to talk about family. That's something that we kind of do in business, but in India, that's not very important. What is important though is title, where you are in a company, what your level, what your hierarchy is, so that people can understand how to address you and talk to you and deal with you, because it's very different how they're going to talk to you depending on what your title is and where you are in the company or what kind of degree that you have. In India, public displays of affection are completely inappropriate. So you don't touch other people, you don't backslap other people. In fact, when you greet, you tend to do a namaste greet, which is you put your hands together, kind of like a pray, and you kind of bow. So touching is just something that doesn't happen. Even like when you call for someone, you don't use your hand, because calling somebody with your hand, like "Hey, come here," like using your index finger to come here, that's something that you do to essentially prostitutes. So when you call for someone, you kind of use your chin to point people over. It's really weird. We wouldn't respond to it, because we would say, like, what's wrong with this person? But you have to be very careful about what you do with your hands, including eating. You only touch things and eat things with your right hand in India. The left hand traditionally, and this is not the case anymore, but there's still plenty of poor places in India where they don't have toilet paper. So the left hand is used to um, do what toilet paper normally does. So the left hand, very dirty. You don't touch people with your left hand. You don't use your left hand to grab anything, especially food. So always use your right hand. I talked about that. Now, Namaste gesture, that's something that people use instead of touching other people. And one last thing that's very interesting about Indian culture, people love to bargain, and they're going to argue a lot about prices. Um, to Westerners, it seems incredible how much people will argue and be abrasive and rude when they're trying to negotiate any kind of good or service. Every single thing is up for negotiation. It's not like you walk into a store and have a price. Everything's up for negotiation, and people really like to do it in India. And to Westerners, is just, we kind of think people are mad or we don't understand why they're doing it, but it's just a cultural thing that it's like a ritual. You bargain, always bargain for goods and services in India. In France, they're more Western. They have a lot of things in common with the United States, but I want to go over a few things that are sort of different. It's a quick handshake and it's a hard handshake, so it's not a kiss on the cheek or anything like that when you're doing business. French aren't fashionably late. French are on time with business and social occasions as well. We may think the French are late, but that's different cultures that are French aren't like that. One thing that you want to know about French is that they don't like to talk about business during meals. They like to talk about cultural things, ideas, theoretical things, art, sophisticated topics. So if you visit people in France to do business, you want to know about current events and you want to be able to have an opinion that you can explain and back up and be interesting during dinner. Dinner definitely won't be used to talk about business. That'll be later on in the day or the next day. It won't be during business. During dinner. You enjoy the meal and you're very pleasant, and you don't talk about how much money you're making from a deal or how much money your company's making. The idea of talking about money is, in general in Europe, is very, very frowned upon. To talk about anything about money, how much, even just like to say, oh, I got a really good deal on this watch. It cost me so and so amount of money. No, you don't do that. The French are very suspicious of people that are friendly from the beginning, so they sort of see Americans as being overly friendly, and that makes them question what our motives are. And then finally, one more thing: the French don't like to be rushed into decision making. They like to take their time, and they like to take a lot of meetings before they make their decision. And then one last region that I want to discuss is Arab countries, because so much business is done in Arab countries with Western countries, especially the United States, because of the energy companies that are over there. One of the things to remember is that Arab countries are very high power distance, and so they're very susceptible and sensitive to differences in power. So if you act like you have to be very careful to not act like you're better or know more than anyone that you're doing business with in these countries, because they're very sensitive to it and they see it as you being very arrogant, or they might be confused about why you're being so confident or why you're kind of telling them what to do. And even though your title may not suggest it, they might not know how to treat you. And then they might treat you the wrong way, or they might completely ignore what you have to say. So be very careful about making other people feel inferior, because when they feel a little bit inferior, it's really a lot in their cultures. Arab countries are very collective, so you never, when you do business with these countries, you never want to talk about you, me, I. You want to talk about your team. Your team did this, your team did that, your group did this, your company did that. Everything is about us and we. And one other thing to think about here, there are so many administrative channels in Arab countries. There's so much bureaucracy and red tape. It's kind of baffling to Americans about how long it takes to do business and how many kind of legal and governmental institutions that there are. But one of the things to remember, and we tend to look down upon that. We're a country. United States is a country that believes in limited government and a lot of individual and private things. And so when we see a country with a lot of government red tape or bureaucracy, we sort of criticize it. But we have to be very careful in the case of Arab countries about criticizing, because remember what we studied in chapter 2. Arab countries derive their law from their religion. And so when you criticize the government in Arab countries, when you criticize law, when you criticize bureaucracy, you're essentially criticizing the word of Muhammad, the holy book or their holy beliefs. And that's much different than in the United States. When we criticize the government, we don't think that we're criticizing anybody's religion. But those two things are intertwined, so we have to be very careful about going through all the proper channels that we can go through. Connections are very important when you're doing business. You have to know who knows what within these bureaucracies, because they're all spread out over all the regions. And finally, these in Arab countries, people like to do business in person. So if you want to know why Dubai has grown so much, or Abu Dhabi has grown so much, in the past 20 years, if you look at kind of a before and after picture, I'm going to show that in class. It'll blow your mind how much these countries have grown. But it's because people have to get there in order to do business with them. They don't do business over the phone. They don't do business over the internet. You have to be there to do business with them, and that has made these countries hubs for in between the East and the West, and for their energy prowess. So that's kind of the last thing I want to talk about.